Stop! Put that bottled water down. Don't ever drink it. Today, one more reason never to buy or drink factory bottled water. Plus, how would you feel if you woke up tomorrow, construction cranes are on your street, and they're building a high-rise condo or apartment building next to your little bungalow? And a follow-up on our last podcast, would you eat a bug to save the planet?
Calling. Call the Growth Buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. Here we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. On a full planet, that means it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and the size of our economy. Of course, that includes exploring ways to shrink our own individual footprints. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and chief scientist here at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies. As always, for cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. Now, my two partners in growth busting, Caitlin and Ben, are not with me for this episode. Boo-hoo. Apparently, spring break sounded like more fun than staying in town and recording a podcast. So I'm going it alone, and I'll do my best to keep you entertained. First up on the list today is some interesting news about bottled water. We here at Growthbusters frown on drinking bottled water. There are just so many things wrong with not just going over to the tap and getting a glass of water from your tap. The whole bottled water industry consumes vast amounts of energy, has a high carbon footprint, and it's really a waste. It's a waste to be moving all those bottles of water around when all of us in the overdeveloped world, we've got decent water flowing out of our tap. And if we're a little concerned about the quality of that water, we can certainly filter it. So all along, I've been a staunch opponent of bottled water. I refuse to drink factory bottled water on principle. But if you've been a little slow to boycott bottled water, well, now there's one more reason you might want to avoid it. It seems that scientists at the State University of New York conducted a study, and they found that out of 259 individual bottles surveyed, 93% of them showed some sign of microplastic contamination, with an average of 325 microplastic particles per liter. Now, this study analyzed bottles from leading brands in the U.S., Canada, and Europe. I'm talking about Aquafina, Dasani, Evian, Nestle Pure Life, and San Pellegrino, and other brands popular in other countries as well. The study estimated that a person who drinks a liter of bottled water a day might be consuming tens of thousands of microplastic pieces each year. Of course, it is unclear what the human health effects of that are. However, fair to say, some components of plastic have been labeled probable carcinogens. I got this information from a story in Salon. The headline, World Health Organization to review reports of microplastic contamination in bottled water. And one of the things they mention is that The Guardian, the UK newspaper The Guardian, reported in June of 2017 that an estimated 1 million plastic water bottles are sold around the world every minute. 1 million bottles a minute. And much of that is completely unnecessary. Next up on our growth-busting news list today is this question about building high-rises right next door. Now, maybe you already live in a high-rise condo or apartment building, and it wouldn't matter to you what's being built next door, but there are a lot of people out there living in both suburban homes and even inner-city single-family homes, one-story houses, in some cases 2 or 3 at the most. And if all of a sudden an 8-story structure is built right next door, well, there are a number of things that happen. One is you have a lot more traffic in your neighborhood. 2, you're shadowed. You get less sunlight. Your urban garden may no longer grow or may be much more challenging to grow. Your great view, if you have stunning vistas of a mountain range, that may go away. Things change. And a lot of people aren't too crazy about that when that happens, and that's why most cities have zoning. They zone neighborhoods so that you have some degree of assurance that if you buy a house in a certain neighborhood, that a strip club isn't going to be built next door, a shopping mall isn't going to be built next door. Of course, we're now learning that there are some downsides to this exclusive zoning process. It makes sense to make sure that you don't have to get in your car and drive across town to go to the grocery store or to do a number of things. It's nice even to have a place to work, that you could just walk out the door and walk down the street or hop on your bicycle and ride several blocks. So I'm not bringing this up in defense of exclusive zoning. Let me give you some background before I tell you why I am bringing it up. It seems that there is a proposal in the state of California to get Californians out of their cars. It's a bill in the state legislature that would allow 8-story buildings near major transit stops, even if local communities object. State Senator Scott Wiener is sponsoring this bill, and the whole idea of it is to foster taller, more compact residential neighborhoods that wean people from long, gas-guzzling commutes, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it probably is intended to aid in affordable housing. California's got one of the worst affordable housing crises out there. The cost of housing in California is ridiculous. So anything that stands in the way of higher density development or development at all actually exacerbates that problem. But it seems that this proposal is sparking a divide in the fight against climate change, specifically how far the law should go to reshape urban lifestyles. I don't know if you know this or not, but transportation accounts for 1/3 of the carbon dioxide emissions in the United States, and it recently surpassed power plants as the largest contributor to global warming. A study found that denser residential building around transit hubs or in central cities could help cut vehicle travel 20 to 40%. Now, that sounds like a good thing. We are not doing nearly enough to curb our carbon emissions, so this, on the face of it, seems smart. And in fact, I'm not going to argue against it, although I do pity the poor people who might end up in the shadow of an 8-story building in a neighborhood that they thought was really going to be just a small, quiet residential neighborhood, and now suddenly might have, 100 new residents right next door. I can understand that they would rather that didn't happen. But that's just the price we have to pay, because we have got to get a handle on carbon emissions. But it's also the price we have to pay because we keep growing our population. We've got to put them somewhere. And California is one of the worst. I mean, that state has about 40 million residents and is climbing. And so the state of California has been slowly chipping away at the rights of individual citizens and the rights of communities to manage their own destiny. They're required to accommodate new residents. A city cannot say we're through. We've reached maturity. We don't have the water treatment capacity, or we don't have the fresh water supply to accommodate more growth. They are required to continue expanding their infrastructure to acquire more growth because the state's population keeps growing. And this brings up the subject of our last podcast, Would You Eat a Bug to Save the Planet?, in which we spent considerable time talking about the extremes that we're willing to go in order to accommodate more growth, in order to somehow find a way to cram more people into our cities or more people into our states or our countries or onto the planet and keep chasing economic growth. So far, we don't seem to be willing to make real efforts to stem that tide of population growth. We're not willing to make real efforts to get unhooked from economic growth. We don't dare suggest that smaller families are a smart way to shrink our carbon footprint. No, we're not willing to do that. That's just politically a little too risky, apparently. So what do? Well, we're at the point now where not only are we being encouraged to give up eating meat and to go vegan, but we're now encouraged to turn to insects to get our protein. Now, I want to make a few things clear that might not have become clear in that last episode. And if you didn't listen, you might want to go back to that and check it out. I am not suggesting that we shouldn't give up meat. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't eat insects. I'm suggesting that I'd rather not eat insects. And the reason I'm not suggesting that we don't is because here we are in a serious state of overshoot. 7.6 billion human beings on the planet. And the scientists who've most seriously attempted to estimate a sustainable human population on the planet Earth tell us that if we were all willing to live modest European lifestyles, which is considerably leaner than the typical lifestyle in North America, for example, we would need to have a total world population of about 2 billion people. Anything more than that, we are living unsustainably, which means we're chipping away at the vital life-supporting ecosystems on the planet and damaging their ability to support future generations. So here we are, 7.6 billion, should have stopped at 2 billion. We didn't. So now we're stuck. We cannot just sit back and continue in our lavish lifestyles in the overdeveloped world. They are lavish, unfortunately, because they are unsustainable on a planet with 7.6 billion people. We can't just sit back and relax and wait for human population to eventually peak and then somehow shrink back to 2 billion people. We're going to have to be active about, one, ending population growth as soon as possible and contracting population as quickly as possible in humane ways. But that's not enough because we are so far into overshoot. We have got to address our overconsumption too. So here we are. We're stuck. We're having to make some of these sacrifices, and that includes probably allowing 8-story, multi-tenant structures in neighborhoods that might wish that they weren't there. It's just a price we have to pay. But what I want to point out is that, in all of the hand-wringing over this, there's no mention of the fact that it is a growing population in California that is making it necessary to do this. They just don't talk about that. The root cause of this problem, the root cause of the climate change problem, and the root cause of the housing affordability crisis in California is people, too many people, and rising. That is just one of the insidious ways that our rights, our joys, our privileges are slowly being given up without us even realizing it, and definitely without us realizing why. That we're giving that up because we have a culture of growth. We're not willing to admit that small is beautiful, after all. And so I just wanted to clarify. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that. Eat bugs. Go for it. We need to do everything we can to shrink our footprint on the planet. But I think it's time that we acknowledge the reason for that and start working on the root causes. We need to get over this love affair with economic growth, and we need to get over our bashfulness about talking about population growth and highly recommending one-child families. We really need one-child families for the next 100 years. And then after that, we might be able to say a two-child family might be the norm. But for now, we need to get serious about both. I'll put links to both the California bill story and the bottled water story and the last episode, Would You Eat a Bug to Save the Planet?, in the show notes for this episode of the Growth Busters podcast. And now, that segment we call Lightening the Load, where usually Ben and Caitlin and I each share something interesting that we do in our own lives to shrink our footprint. Well, no Caitlin and no Ben, so it's just Dave today. And in the last episode, I talked about using used paper in the printer. In my, when I'm printing something off of my computer, I reuse paper and I print on the backside of some document that I don't need any longer. And I darn sure make sure I print on both sides if I'm having to use virgin paper. And of course, recycled paper all the way. But now, today, I want to tell you about something I do that goes one step further. And that is reusing paper for grocery lists, to-do lists, notes to my wife, etc., things like that. If I find some piece of paper that's got room on it for a grocery list, I save it. And I'm talking about, business reply envelopes that come in some junk mail, just some of the junk mail itself, check stubs that I don't need anymore, just anything. any piece of paper that I am getting ready to put into the recycle bin, first I evaluate and I say, is there a great space on here to write notes on or grocery lists? And if there is, then I put it in a little slot in the kitchen for just such purposes. Now, this is tiny. Does this make much of a difference? Well, Dave Gardner doing it doesn't make much of a difference. But what if 1 million people were doing it? Or what if 100 million people were doing it? It might. And that doesn't feel half bad to know that you are just going that extra step to not be wasteful. All right, well, that brings us to the close of this Growthbusters podcast. Our next episode, we'll definitely have Caitlin and Ben back. Don't forget to explore issues at growthbusters.org, subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app, and even give us a review if you like what we're doing. If you haven't seen the documentary Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth, it's easy enough to find at growthbustersmovie.org or on Amazon. I'm Dave Gardner. Thanks a lot for listening. This has been the Growthbusters Podcast.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.